The morning Celia Baker drove her wagon out of Dusthaven for the last time. The sky was the color of a bruise healing purple and yellow, and shot through with the pale, tentative light of a sun that had not yet decided whether the day deserved its full attention. She had said her goodbyes, every last one of them. She had pressed her palm flat against the cold wood of the mercantile counter, where old Mr. Petty kept his penny jars, and she had thanked him for his credit during the lean months after her husband died. She had stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and let Miss Aldridge hug her so hard that the brooch on the teacher's collar left a small red mark on Celia's cheek, and she had not minded one bit. She had even crossed to the other side of the main street to knock on the door of the livery, where Earl Dupont had smelled of hay and horse liniment, and had held his hat against his chest, and told her that her late husband Robert had been a fine man, one of the finest, and that he hoped she found whatever she was looking for out there in the wide country. She had thanked Earl, too. She had thanked everyone. Dusthaven, Kansas, in the autumn of 1874 was not a town that let go of a widow easily. It was the kind of place that had opinions about things, about whether a woman ought to be selling her land, about whether moving west toward Colorado was sensible, about whether 26 years old was too young to be making such decisions alone. Celia had heard all of those opinions over the past 3 months, delivered in tones ranging from gentle concern to outright indignation, and she had nodded through every single one of them because she had been raised to be polite, and because none of those opinions were going to change her mind. Robert had been gone since February. Pneumonia, the doctor had said, which felt like a clean and clinical word for something that had sounded so brutal in the dark of their bedroom, the rattling and the gasping, and then the terrible silence that replaced it. They had been married 4 years. They had no children, a fact that the women of Dusthaven seemed to find both tragic and slightly suspicious, as though Celia herself were somehow to blame for the empty crib in the corner of the room. The farm had been Robert's dream, not hers, and without him it was simply 160 acres of hard Kansas ground that reminded her of everything she had lost every single morning when she walked out to feed the chickens. So she had sold it. She had sold it to the Hendersons, a young couple from Ohio who had arrived in town the previous spring with matching hopeful expressions and more enthusiasm than experience, and she had wished them genuinely well. She had packed what mattered into the wagon: her mother's quilt, her father's Bible, a change of clothes and her good dress, the small iron cooking pot, a jar of dried beans, salt, flour, a side of bacon, her rifle, and the tin box where she kept the $62 that represented the entirety of her worldly savings after the sale of the farm and the settling of the debts Robert had left behind. Her plan was Fort Collins, Colorado, where her cousin Agnes lived with her husband Thomas, who ran a dry goods store and had written to Celia twice since Robert's passing to say that there was always a room and always work if she needed it. Agnes was plain-spoken and practical, and did not ask unnecessary questions, which was exactly the kind of person Celia needed to be around right now. The wagon was nothing remarkable. A standard farm wagon with a canvas cover that leaked in heavy rain, pulled by a single reliable bay mare named Tuesday, because Celia had bought her on a Tuesday and had never thought of a better name. Tuesday was steady and calm and had been with Celia longer than Robert had, which was a fact Celia had never shared with anyone because she suspected it might sound unkind, even though it was simply true. She had said her goodbyes. She had pointed Tuesday's nose west and clicked her tongue and let Dusthaven fall behind her, and she had not cried, which surprised her a little because she had expected to. Instead, she had felt something that was closer to relief, raw and a little guilty, but real. The road west out of Dusthaven ran straight for the first few miles through flat grassland that had gone golden and dry in the October cool, and then it began to dip and curve as it followed the line of a creek bed toward the low hills in the distance. Celia knew this road well enough for the first 10 miles. Beyond that, she had a map, a careful one, drawn for her by the postmaster, who had made the journey himself some years back and had marked the water sources and the trading posts with small, careful X's in brown ink. It was about 3 miles outside of town, at the point where the road curved sharply around a limestone outcropping, and the creek came close enough to the track that you could hear it if the wind was right, that she first heard the sound. It was a horse. She recognized that much immediately, the rhythm of hooves, fast and loose, coming from somewhere off to her left, from the direction of the creek. Tuesday's ears went flat and forward, and her stride shortened in that particular way that meant she was uncertain, and Celia tightened her grip on the reins and sat straighter on the wagon bench. Then the horse came out of nowhere. It burst through the scrub brush at the edge of the road at a dead run, a big roan gelding with empty stirrups swinging and a broken rein trailing, and it planted itself directly in front of Tuesday with a wild whinny that sent the bay mare lurching sideways with a force that nearly threw Celia from the bench. She hauled back hard on Tuesday's reins, felt the wagon shudder and tilt as the left rear wheel caught the soft shoulder of the road, and for one long, terrible second she was certain the whole thing was going to go over. It did not. Tuesday stopped, trembling, her hooves churning the dirt. The roan wheeled in a panicked circle, its eyes white-rimmed, and Celia got one good look at the saddle, a good saddle, working saddle, not some wild animal, before she heard the voice. "Whoa, whoa, I have got it, ma'am, hold your horse." He came through the brush about 10 seconds after his horse, at a run, one hand extended toward the roan's trailing rein, and the other reaching instinctively toward Celia's mare, even before he had assessed the full situation. He was tall, with the kind of lean build that came from actual work rather than any ambition toward it, wearing a dark canvas jacket that had seen better days and a hat that had been shaped by weather rather than intention. He caught the roan's rein on the first grab and planted himself between the two horses with a calm authority that quieted both of them within moments. Celia sat on the wagon bench and breathed. Her heart was hammering. Tuesday was still quivering slightly beneath the traces, and Celia could feel the whole wagon sitting at a slight angle where the wheel had caught the shoulder of the road. "Are you all right?" the man said. He had turned to look at her properly now, one hand still firm on the roan's bridle, and his face was the kind of face that was not conventionally handsome, but was so direct and earnest that handsomeness felt beside the point. He looked about 30, maybe a year or two either side. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that she noticed despite herself, and then was irritated at herself for noticing. "My wheel," Celia said, because that was the most practical concern. "I think my rear wheel is in the ditch." He moved immediately, tying the roan's rein loosely around a scrub branch and coming around the back of the wagon to look. She heard him crouch down, heard the soft sound of his boots in the dirt, and then a pause. "It is in the ditch," he confirmed. He straightened and came around to stand at Tuesday's head, looking up at Celia with an expression that was both apologetic and intensely focused. "It is not deep and the wheel looks whole. I can have you out in a few minutes if you will let me." He paused. "I am sorry about Hector. He spooked at a snake down by the creek and I went off. I should not have let him run." A brief, rueful expression crossed his face. "That was foolish of me. You went off your horse." Celia looked from him to the roan and back again. "Are you hurt?" "Pride mostly," he said, and there was a dry quality to it that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "My name is Micah Carver. I'm heading northwest toward the Black Hills trading route. I will get your wagon out of the ditch and I will make sure your mare is settled before I go anywhere." "Celia Baker," she said, because it seemed right to introduce herself back. "And I am going west. Fort Collins eventually." Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration. "That is a long way alone." "I am aware," she said, and her voice came out a little cooler than she intended, because she had heard variations of that observation approximately 40 times in the past month, and she was tired of it. He caught the tone and did not pursue the subject. Instead, he went about the business of getting her wagon out of the ditch with the practical efficiency of a man who had dealt with worse problems in worse conditions, using a length of rope from his own saddle pack to rig a pull assist, speaking quietly to Tuesday the entire time in a low, steady voice that seemed to work as well on the horse as it probably did on most other nervous creatures. Within 15 minutes the wagon was level on the road again, the wheel was sound, and Celia had climbed down to check Tuesday's legs herself, something she always did after any kind of stumble because Robert had taught her that, and it was one of the things he had been right about. "She is fine," Micah said, watching from a respectful distance. "Good strong legs on her." "I know," Celia said, but without the coolness this time. "Her name is Tuesday." "Good name," he said, and this time there was a genuine and uncomplicated smile, and it changed his whole face in a way she had not anticipated. She looked away. "Thank you for the help," she said, climbing back up to the wagon bench. "I hope the rest of your ride is less eventful." "Likewise," he said, collecting his rope and moving back toward the roan. Then he stopped. She was already gathering the reins, already orienting herself west again, and he stood there for a moment with his hand on Hector's neck, looking up at her with an expression she could not quite read. "The creek crossing at Miller's Ford," he said. "About 8 miles out. The water is running high right now from the recent rains. If you are going through there today, go at the wide, shallow spot to the north of the main ford. There is a line of flat rocks just under the surface, and if you take it slow, Tuesday will find them. The main ford is too deep right now for a single horse and a loaded wagon." Celia looked at him. "How do you know I have not made that crossing 100 times?" "You might have," he said, "but the water level changed in the last 3 days. It might not be what you remember." She held his gaze for a moment. There was nothing presumptuous in it. He was not trying to make himself important or to imply that she could not manage. He was simply telling her a thing he knew that she might not know. The way you told a stranger the road ahead was muddy because it would be rude not to. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more fully than she had meant it the first time. He nodded and stepped back, and she clicked to Tuesday and let the mare move forward, and she did not look back. But she was aware of him standing there watching until the road curved and the scrub brush rose between them. And she was aware, too, of the way the morning felt slightly different than it had before, not less empty exactly, but differently textured, as though the landscape had acquired one small point of focus where before there had been none. The creek crossing at Miller's Ford was exactly as he had described it. The main ford was running fast and brown, clearly deeper than it looked from the bank, and Celia was profoundly grateful she had been warned as she guided Tuesday north along the bank to find the line of flat rocks that lay just below the surface, pale and solid through the moving water. She took it slow, the way he had said, and Tuesday found the rocks herself on the 3rd step and moved across with careful, deliberate care, and they came out the other side dry and intact. She made camp that first night in a hollow between 2 low hills, where a stand of cottonwood trees offered some shelter from the wind, which had come up from the northwest around mid-afternoon, and had a November edge to it despite the calendar still saying October. She built a small fire, cooked beans and salt bacon in the iron pot, ate with her back against a wagon wheel and the rifle across her knees out of habit rather than any specific fear, and watched the stars appear one by one in the clearing sky overhead. She thought about Dusthaven. She thought about Robert's grave at the edge of the cemetery, the wooden marker she had paid for herself, the small bunch of dried flowers she had left there yesterday morning that would be dust by spring. She thought about the empty farm and the empty bedroom, and the 4 years of a life that had been good in its way but had never quite felt entirely like hers. She thought, briefly, and with a slight sense of irritation at herself, about a pair of gray-green eyes and a roan horse named Hector. Then she banked the fire and pulled her mother's quilt around her shoulders and went to sleep in the wagon bed, and the wind moved through the cottonwood leaves overhead with a sound like the pages of a very long letter being turned. The second day took her through higher country, and the road narrowed and grew rougher in a way that made Celia glad Tuesday was as steady as she was. There was a trading post at a crossroads called Beecher's Flat, a rough collection of 3 buildings that looked as though they were holding each other upright by mutual agreement, where she stopped to water Tuesday and buy a small sack of cornmeal from a sun-dried woman named Mrs. Holt, who had the wary, watchful eyes of someone who had been disappointed by a great many things and had reached a settled peace with that fact. "You going west alone?" Mrs. Holt asked, in a tone that was not quite the same as the Dusthaven version of that question. This one had a kind of flat assessment to it rather than judgment. "To Fort Collins," Celia said. "My cousin is there." Mrs. Holt considered this. "The road after the canyon fork gets rough in the 3rd week of October. You want to be through the canyon section before the first hard frost or the shale gets slick." "How far to the canyon fork from here?" 3 days at a decent pace, 2.5 if you push." "I will push," Celia said. Mrs. Holt nodded as though this confirmed something she had already decided about Celia, and refilled her water canteen without being asked, and only charged her for the cornmeal. Celia was back on the road within half an hour. She was thinking about the canyon fork and the frost timetable, and whether Tuesday could manage a slightly longer daily distance if the road was good. And so she almost missed the sound at first, the particular rhythm of another horse on the road behind her, gaining ground at an easy lope. She resisted looking back for about 30 seconds, which she considered a reasonable exhibition of dignity, and then looked back. It was Micah Carver on the roan, Hector, coming up the road at a comfortable pace that suggested he had been behind her for some time and had not been in any particular hurry to announce himself. When he saw her looking back, he raised one hand in a straightforward greeting and brought Hector to a walk as he pulled even with the wagon. "Mrs. Baker," he said, "the ford was all right. Just as you described," she said. "Good information. The trading post back there, did you stop?" "I did." Mrs. Holt mentioned the canyon section. He nodded slowly. "She knows that road. She is right about the frost." Celia looked at him. He was riding easily, Hector moving smoothly alongside Tuesday's walking pace, and there was nothing in his manner that was forward or presumptuous. He looked, if anything, slightly uncertain of his reception, which she found both transparent and oddly endearing. "You are also going northwest," she said. "I am." "Is your route along this road?" "For the next 4 days, yes." She considered this for a moment. She was a practical woman, and practically speaking, a woman traveling alone across open Kansas and eastern Colorado in October of 1874 was not entirely without risk. Not enormous risk. This was not the deep frontier, and the road was reasonably traveled, but not without it either. The Cheyenne had been largely driven from the Kansas plains by this point, a fact that made Celia feel something complicated and sad that she could not entirely articulate. But there were other concerns: weather, road agents occasionally on the more isolated stretches, the simple physical reality that if something went wrong with the wagon and she was alone, it was a problem, and if something went wrong and there was another person present, it was less of one. "I do not need a guardian," she said. "I know that," he said simply. "But if you are going the same direction anyway," she said, and left it there. "Then there is no reason we should not travel the same road," he said, completing the logic without any suggestion of triumph. So that was how it began. They did not speak much that first afternoon together on the road, which suited Celia. She had gotten used to her own company over the past months, and she found that she did not require conversation to feel comfortable, and she suspected. She was not sure why, but she suspected that Micah Carver was similar. He rode alongside the wagon at a distance that was respectful without being standoffish, and when she stopped to consult the postmaster's map, he would look at it with her and offer what he knew of the terrain. And when she made her noon stop beside a stream to water Tuesday and eat a bit of bread, he made his own fire a few yards distant and ate his own food without inviting himself to hers, which she noted and approved of. It was late in the afternoon when he said, "You said Robert Baker. Was your husband related to the Bakers who had the mill over by Salina?" Celia looked at him. Yes, Robert's uncle had the mill. How do you know the Celia Bakers? I worked for them for a summer about 6 years ago, he said. I was 24 and looking for work. Robert's uncle, Henry Baker, was a decent man. He paid what he promised, which was not as common as it ought to be. No, Celia agreed. It was not. I heard Robert pass this winter, Micah said, and his voice was quiet and direct in the way that people were direct about death when they were not frightened of it. I am sorry for it. Thank you, she said, and it was the first time she had said those words in response to condolences, and had not felt the slight theatrical weight of the expected exchange. He said it plainly, and she received it plainly, and that was that. Were you in Dusthaven long? He asked. 4 years since the wedding. She adjusted Tuesday's pace slightly around a rut in the road. I am from Missouri originally. Lawrence. My family is there still, what is left of it. You are not going back to Missouri. My cousin Agnes is in Fort Collins. She is practical company. A pause. And Missouri is not. There is nothing pulling me back there. He nodded and did not press it. They rode in silence for a while, and the road wound up into slightly higher ground where the grass was shorter and browner, and the wind had a clarity to it that tasted like cold water. What is in the Black Hills trading route for you? She asked eventually. I am meeting a man named Patterson who has a freight operation. He is looking for drivers who know the western routes, and I have done the Denver to Cheyenne run 3 times. It is steady work through the winter. He said this in the same practical way he said most things, without apology or embellishment. I had a ranch down near Dodge City for 2 years. That ended. How? A pause. I had a partner. He decided he did not want a partner anymore, and he had a lawyer and I did not. He said it with the particular flatness of a man who had made his peace with an injustice. By accepting that peace was more useful than rage, even if the rage was justified. The law in Dodge City in 1871 was its own particular thing. Celia thought about that. I am sorry, she said. It was a lesson, he said, and then after a moment with something drier and more real, an expensive one. She almost smiled. She looked away so he would not see it, which was also something she noticed about herself and was mildly puzzled by. They made camp that evening in the last light, at a good flat spot near a dry creek bed, where there was enough deadwood for a proper fire, and enough elevation to see a good distance in every direction. Celia unharnessed Tuesday and hobbled her on the good grass while Micah took care of Hector, and without any discussion, they built one fire between them and cooked separately but ate within the warmth of the same flame, Tuesday and Hector grazing companionably nearby. And the stars came out overhead in numbers that always reminded Celia of how small and specific a human life was against the scale of everything else, which she found more comforting than not. Can I ask you something? Micah said. You can try, she said. What are you going to do in Fort Collins? Past staying with your cousin? Celia stirred the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise and vanish. Agnes's husband Thomas has a dry goods store. There might be work there, or I have been thinking about teaching. She said the last part with a slight hesitation, as though she were offering it to the air to see if it survived the exposure. You would be good at it, he said. She looked at him. You do not know anything about me. I know you read a map well and you kept your head when 2 spooked horses nearly put you in a ditch, he said. And you listen when someone gives you information, which is rarer than it ought to be. Teaching needs all of those things. Celia looked back at the fire. The warmth in her chest was something she could not fully account for and was not entirely comfortable with, so she chose not to account for it at all. What about you? She asked. Is freight driving what you want to be doing? No, he said with a directness that surprised her. But it is what I can do right now. He looked across the fire at her. I would like land again eventually, not in Kansas. I want to be somewhere that the horizon is not quite so relentless. Celia laughed. It came out before she could stop it, a real laugh, surprised out of her at the precision of that description. The horizon in Kansas was a particular kind of exhausting if you were not native to it, an infinity that eventually felt less like freedom and more like a dare. Micah smiled at the sound of her laugh, and this time she saw it in full rather than turning away, and it occurred to her that he had one of those smiles that was entirely genuine precisely because it never came without cause. "The Colorado country is different," she said. "I have only heard descriptions." "Mountains," he said. "Real ones. The kind you can see from 50 miles away and they still look impossibly large when you arrive. You have been to Colorado." "Twice. Fort Collins itself is a good town, newer but organized. The army post brings some trouble, but mostly it keeps the peace." He paused. "Your cousin has chosen well." "Agnes has always chosen well," Celia said. "She has never in her life made a decision that could be described as romantic or impractical. I sometimes envied that about her. And now I am trying to cultivate it myself," she said, which was honest enough to surprise herself slightly. He studied her for a moment across the fire with those gray-green eyes that she was trying not to find remarkable, and said, "I think you are doing fine." She was not sure why those 4 simple words settled in her chest the way they did. She supposed it was because she had not heard them from anyone in a very long time, not from the well-meaning women of Dusthaven who thought she was making a terrible mistake, not from Agnes's practical letters, not from her own heart, which had been too busy cataloging its own damages to offer any assessments of her progress. She thanked him and they turned, and not long after, Celia in the wagon bed with her mother's quilt and Micah rolled in his bedroll on the ground at a proper distance, and the wind moved over the Kansas grass with that particular sound. It had low and continuous and strangely intimate, like the breathing of something very large and very old. The third day brought clouds that built through the morning into a proper October storm that arrived around mid-afternoon with cold rain and a wind from the northwest that made the canvas cover on Celia's wagon shudder and buckle in a way that alarmed her more than she showed. She kept Tuesday moving at a steady walk, her head down against the rain, and Micah rode beside her in his canvas jacket, which was not at all adequate for this kind of weather, and which he did not complain about once. They pushed through to a small roadside in more of a large house with a barn attached, run by a German family named Schreiber, where the barn roof was sound, and there was a common room with a wood stove that turned the evening into something almost comfortable. Mrs. Schreiber brought them soup from a pot that had been on the fire all day, and there was bread, and the stove put out enough heat to dry their outer clothes and most of their dignity. The Schreibers had 2 small children who circled Celia with the irresistible gravitational pull of small children everywhere, and she found herself on the floor beside the stove at some point in the evening with the younger one, a boy of about 3 named Klaus, who had a collection of wooden animals that he was very serious about and wanted to demonstrate. She played along with complete seriousness, and at some point she looked up and found Micah watching her from across the room with an expression she could not name, something open and careful at the same time, that he did not immediately look away from when their eyes met, which meant she was the one who looked away, and her heart did something small and complicated that she told it firmly was none of its business. When the children had gone to bed, Mrs. Schreiber sat with them at the table while Mr. Schreiber smoked his pipe by the stove, and the conversation wandered through the topics that conversations between travelers always wandered through. The state of the roads, the weather, whether the corn harvest had been decent, the most recent news from the east. The Schreibers had been in Kansas for 6 years, having come from Baden with nothing, and built what they had from the ground up, and there was a quiet pride in how they spoke about it that Celia found both admirable and a little heartbreaking, because she knew how precarious that kind of pride could be. Micah paid for their lodging without making a performance of it, and when Celia caught his eye about it later, he simply said, "His horse spooked and put your wagon in a ditch. Consider it an ongoing debt," which was the kind of logic she could not reasonably argue with. They left the next morning into a cleared sky so blue it looked painted, the air sharp and thin and smelling of wet grass and the distant cold promise of the mountains. The road had improved firmer after the rain had run off, the ruts filled and settled, and Tuesday moved with a lightness in her step that suggested she had appreciated the barn rest. It was on this fourth day that the quality of their conversation changed, the way a river changes when it passes out of the hills and into open country, not faster necessarily, but wider and deeper in some places than you expected. Celia found herself telling him about Lawrence, about growing up in a town that had known more than its share of violence and grief in the years before and during the war, about the way that shaped a person's relationship to permanence, made you understand that things could be taken without warning, which was either crippling or clarifying depending on how you metabolized it. She had mostly managed clarifying, she said, though there had been years that were more crippling. Micah told her about growing up in Tennessee, a farm that his father had worked with a stubbornness that amounted almost to personal grievance against the land, and about leaving at 18 because there was nothing there for him that he could see, and the years of working his way west cattle drives, lumber camps, the brief and disastrous attempt at silver mining in Nevada that had lasted 4 months and produced $30 and a spectacular education in the gap between what men said and what they meant. He told her about the ranch near Dodge, and this time he told her more of it, the partner whose name was Cole Eady, who had been charming and persuasive and who had, Micah came to understand slowly and then all at once, been maneuvering from the start to get the land. Cole Eady was still there, presumably, working land that was half Micah's by right and entirely his, by a piece of legal theft that Micah had spent a year trying to fight and eventually had to let go of because he had run out of money, and there was no law in Dodge City that was not also Cole Eady's neighbor and drinking companion. "That is a significant injustice," Celia said. She said it plainly, not as comfort but as fact. "It is," he said. "I got used to it." "You do not have to have gotten used to it to have moved past it," she said. "Those are different things." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "they are." He looked at her with something like gratitude. "That is a better way of putting it than I have managed in 3 years of thinking about it." They made camp that evening near the Colorado border, in a place where the land began its first tentative gestures toward the mountains, slightly more elevation, slightly redder soil, the distant suggestion of something enormous on the horizon that the setting sun gilded with an extravagance that seemed almost theatrical. Celia stood beside the wagon and watched the sunset finish itself, and Micah stood a few feet away, and neither of them said anything for several minutes because there was nothing to say that would improve on the view, and they had gotten over these 4 days to a place where silence between them was not a gap but a shared space. Then Micah said, very quietly, "Celia." Just her name. Not a question, not a statement. Just her name, in a voice that had dropped to its lowest register, and she turned and looked at him and found that he was already looking at her with that open, careful expression that she had been cataloging without intending to. And she understood in that moment that he was about to say something that would change the particular shape of the territory between them, and that she was standing at a kind of ford, not unlike Miller's Ford, where the water was deeper than it appeared, and the safe crossing was not the obvious one. "I do not know how to say this without it sounding," he began and stopped and pressed his mouth together in a way that was endearing precisely because it was so uncharacteristic of his usual directness. "I have not said anything like this in a long time and I am out of practice." "Then say it plainly," she said. "You have always managed that well enough." He looked at her for another moment. "I like you," he said, "considerably, more than I expected. More than is probably sensible given that it has been 4 days and you are going to Fort Collins and I was going the other way." A pause. "I am not entirely sure I am still going the other way." Celia held very still. Her heart was doing things she had not authorized. The sunset behind him was pulling every warm color out of the sky, and Tuesday and Hector were grazing behind him with the comfortable indifference of horses, and the grass smelled of cold and coming autumn, and she thought about practical things for exactly 3 seconds before she stopped thinking about practical things. "Fort Collins is on the northern trading route," she said. It is, he said. Which is not entirely inconsistent with the Black Hills freight operation. No, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. It is not entirely inconsistent. Then I suppose, she said, you might as well come to Fort Collins. It was not a declaration. It was a beginning offered in practical terms, which was the only way she knew to offer anything, and he received it the same way, with a small nod and a warmth in his eyes that said he understood exactly what was underneath the practical terms, and that he was not in a hurry, and that he was not going anywhere. They reached Fort Collins on the 7th day of travel, coming in from the east as the morning was still cold and sharp. The buildings of the town arranged along the river with the particular deliberate tidiness of a place that had grown quickly and was still deciding what it wanted to be. The army post at Camp Collins sat at the north end, and the civilian town had grown up around and beyond it with the optimism of the frontier raw lumber. New paint, streets that had been laid out with a ruler before anyone had lived in them long enough to know which way the foot traffic would actually flow. Agnes met Celia at the gate of her house with the particular expression of a woman who had been worried but would not say so, and hugged her hard, and then held her at arm's length and looked at her with the frank assessment that was Agnes's particular brand of love. You look, Agnes began, and then her eyes went to Micah, who had reined Hector in at a respectful distance and was waiting with his hat off. Who is this? Micah Carver, Celia said. He helped me get out of a ditch outside of Dusthaven, and then we shared the road. Agnes looked at Micah for a moment with those frank assessing eyes, and then she looked back at Celia with an expression that said she had formed and was holding several opinions in reserve, and said, "Well, come inside, both of you. Thomas has coffee on." Thomas Aldrich was a comfortable, fair-minded man in his early 40s who had built his dry goods store from a single-room operation to a proper establishment with a storeroom and a loading dock, and who had the particular quiet confidence of a person who had always known what he wanted and had simply applied himself steadily to getting it. He shook Micah's hand with the directness of a man who assessed other men quickly and without drama, and said, "Freight driver, is it? Patterson's operation." "That was the plan," Micah said. "I know Jim Patterson. He is reliable," Thomas said, which in Thomas's language was high praise. "He runs cargo up to Cheyenne twice a month and down to Denver once. Good money if you know the roads." He poured coffee. "You know the roads." "I know them well enough," Micah said. "Better after this week." Thomas asked a few more questions, professional and practical, and Micah answered them in the same register. And somewhere in this conversation, Celia noticed that the two men were talking to each other with the uncomplicated ease of people who respected the same things, which told her something about Micah that all 7 days of conversation had not told her as directly. Agnes pulled Celia into the kitchen while the men were talking and said, in a low voice that was nonetheless perfectly clear, 7 days on the road together. "We shared a road," Celia said. "Celia Baker," Agnes said, in the voice she had been using on Celia since they were girls together in Lawrence. "You have not looked like that in a very long time. I do not know what you mean. You look like a person who has found their footing after a long stretch of uncertain ground," Agnes said. "And he looks at you like," she pressed her lips together. "He looks at you like you matter, which you do, of course, but it has been a while since anyone looked at you like you knew it." Celia set her coffee cup down and looked at the kitchen window at the November light coming through it. "It has been 7 days," she said. "Some people know in 7 minutes," Agnes said, which was remarkably romantic coming from Agnes, who was not generally given to romanticism. "I knew about Thomas before the first conversation was finished. I thought it was ridiculous at the time, too." Celia looked at her cousin. "I am not ready," she said, and it was honest. There are still things I am carrying." "I know," Agnes said, more gently. "I am not suggesting you get married tomorrow. I am suggesting you do not let being not ready turn into an excuse for staying still." It was advice, Celia thought, that Agnes had probably been saving for some time. Micah did meet with Jim Patterson that first afternoon, and Patterson did offer him work, a regular route between Fort Collins and Cheyenne with a loaded freight wagon, departing twice monthly. It was good, steady wages, enough to live on and save a little, and Micah accepted it and found himself a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Farley, who kept a clean house and served a decent supper, and had a policy of strict respectability that was enforced with the cheerful inflexibility of a person who had never in her life second-guessed a principle. Celia, meanwhile, settled into Agnes and Thomas's spare room and began the business of building a life, which was at first indistinguishable from the business of being very busy in order to avoid thinking too hard about what the life was supposed to look like. She helped Thomas in the store, first just with the stocking and organizing, which she was efficient at, and then increasingly with the account books, which she turned out to be remarkably good at, and then with the customers, because she had a way of listening to what a person actually needed as opposed to what they asked for. That made the store's reputation grow by a quiet but measurable degree over the weeks she was there. She and Micah saw each other often, because Fort Collins in November of 1874 was not a large town, and two people who wanted to see each other in a small town found that the logistics arranged themselves with very little effort. He ate Sunday supper at Thomas and Agnes's on most Sundays, which was Agnes's doing, announced one evening with complete casualness, "I have asked Mr. Carver to join us Sunday. He ought not to spend every Sunday at Mrs. Farley's table," and which Celia received with the look she gave Agnes in such situations, a look that Agnes received with the look she gave in return, which communicated an entire settled argument without a word. They walked. That was how it grew for those first weeks in Fort Collins. On the evenings when Micah was in town between freight runs, they walked along the river, up into the lower hills where the trail was clear and the aspens had gone entirely gold and then entirely bare, through the town itself in the blue evening light that fell very early now in November. They talked the way people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other's minds, not performing, not trying to impress, just the steady and increasingly comfortable exchange of two people getting to know each other's particular shape. He told her about Tennessee Moore, about his mother, who had died when he was 12, of a fever, and whose absence had defined his father's temperament for the rest of the man's life in ways that were not always kind. About a teacher he had had for 1 year at age 10 who had given him a book, the first book that had been given to him rather than assigned, and that the book had been a collection of newspaper accounts of explorations in the American West, and that he had read it until it fell apart, and that was, in a way that was simple and not melodramatic, why he was here. Celia told him about the war years in Lawrence, about the raid in 1863 that had taken the life of her father and a neighbor, and had turned the town inside out with grief and fury, about growing up in the aftermath of that, in a town that was rebuilding itself not just physically, but in some fundamental way in its understanding of what it was and what it could be. About how that had made her simultaneously more cautious about attachment things could be taken, and more deliberate about it, all the more reason to choose carefully what you held on to. Robert was safe, she said one evening, sitting on a flat rock above the river while the last light went out of the sky. That was most of what I knew about why I married him. He was steady and kind and not going anywhere, after the years in Lawrence that felt like enough. And was it? Micah asked. He was sitting beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. For a while, she said, and then we were just parallel, not unhappy exactly, but not. She stopped. I do not know if that is a terrible thing to say about a man who died. It is an honest thing, he said. Which is better than a comfortable lie. She looked at his profile in the last light. She had been looking at him, she realized, for some time now. Not quickly and away as she had done on the road, but with the kind of steadiness that meant she had stopped pretending she was not. "What do you want?" she asked, Not about the land, not about the freight work, just the plain question. He turned to look at her. I want to stop moving, he said. I want a place that is mine, genuinely mine, that no Cole Edie can take from me. I want to build something that lasts. He held her gaze. I want someone to build it with. That is a significant thing to say, she said. I know, he said. I am saying it anyway. She was quiet for a long moment. The river moved below them with the sound of cold water over stones. A coyote called somewhere on the far hill and did not call again. I am not there yet, she said. I am working towards something, but I am not there yet. I need you to know that. I know that, he said. I am not asking you to be somewhere you are not. I am telling you where I am. He paused. So you have the information. She almost laughed again, that surprised, genuine laugh that happened around him more than she entirely planned for. So I have the information, she repeated. In case it is useful, he said, and there was the dry quality that was not quite humor but was adjacent to it, and she felt the warmth move through her that she had by now stopped pretending she did not feel. November became December, and Fort Collins under snow was a different country, quieter, more interior, the mountains to the west appearing and disappearing through curtains of weather. The town gathered around its stoves and the ordinary warmth of daily proximity. Micah's freight runs continued on a schedule that the winter weather complicated but did not stop, because Jim Patterson was the kind of man who had built his operation on reliability and was not going to let a snowstorm compromise his reputation. Micah came back from the Cheyenne run in early December with his beard frosted and his canvas jacket conclusively inadequate for the conditions, and Thomas Aldrich sold him a proper winter coat from the store at something that was definitely not the full price, and Celia wrapped the coat in brown paper because Agnes asked her to, and because she would not admit to anyone, including herself, how much she had been relieved to see him come back. It was the Sunday supper in mid-December that changed things, or rather, that made visible what had already changed. Agnes had made a roast, a proper one, and Thomas had opened a bottle of something he had been keeping for a good occasion, and the four of them sat at the table in the lamplight with the snow coming down outside the windows and the stove making the room smell of pine and wool drying, and Celia looked across the table at Micah and found him already looking at her, and the look between them was not complicated or uncertain or provisional. It was simply there, complete. As natural as the river finding its way downhill. Agnes caught it. Of course Agnes caught it. Agnes caught everything. After supper, when Thomas and Micah were talking freight logistics at the table and Agnes was washing up, Agnes said to Celia in a low voice in the kitchen, "There it is." "There what is?" Celia said, drying dishes. "You know what," Agnes said. Celia set down the dish towel. She looked at her cousin, who was looking back at her with an expression of complete patience and zero mercy. "What if I," Celia began and stopped. "What if you what?" "What if I am doing this because I am lonely and it is winter and he is kind," she said. "What if it is just that?" Agnes considered this seriously, which was one of the things Celia most valued about her. She did not dismiss it or wave it away. She thought about it. "Is that what it feels like?" Agnes asked finally. Celia thought about 7 days on a road. She thought about a man standing in front of 2 spooked horses with a perfect calm. She thought about the way he had said things about the Tennessee teacher, about the injustice of the ranch, about wanting to stop moving with no attempt to make them sound better or more bearable than they were. She thought about the particular smile that only appeared when something genuinely earned it. "No," she said, "it does not feel like that." "Then stop being afraid of it," Agnes said, and went back to washing dishes with the air of someone who had said the necessary thing and was done. That evening, when Micah was leaving, Celia followed him to the door and they stood in the small, cold space of the covered porch with the snow falling past the edge of the roof, and she said, "I have the information." He looked at her. "You said you were telling me where you were, so I had the information," she said. "I have it. And I want to tell you where I am." She breathed in the cold air. "I am not there yet, but I am getting there, and I want you to know that." Something moved through his face that was not quite surprise because some part of him had been waiting for it but was still deeply felt. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is good information to have." "I thought so," she said. He lifted one hand and very carefully, with a deliberateness that asked permission in every degree of its movement, tucked a strand of her hair back from her face where the wind had pulled it. It was a small and simple thing, and it was the most tender gesture she had experienced in longer than she wanted to calculate, and she stood still under it and let herself feel it and did not look away. "Good night, Celia," he said. "Good night, Micah," she said. He walked off into the snow and she stood on the porch watching until the darkness took him, and then she went inside and Agnes looked at her face and smiled to herself and said absolutely nothing, which was the most considerate thing she had done all year. Christmas in Fort Collins was a modest affair by the standards of Eastern towns, but was full of warmth and community. The church on the central square, decorated with pine boughs and candles, the stores all offering their particular seasonal goods, Mrs. Farley's boarding house smelling of cinnamon and dried apple for the entire week of December. There was a dance on Christmas Eve at the community hall, which was the social event of the season, and Celia went with Agnes and Thomas, and Micah met them there, and they danced twice together, which was exactly the number of times you could dance with a person in Fort Collins in 1874 without it becoming a public announcement. And Celia decided she did not particularly care if it was a public announcement. The dance was a fiddle and guitar affair, played by three men who had been playing together so long they moved as one organism, and the hall was warm with bodies and lantern light, and the particular reckless gaiety that a community assembles at the end of a hard year because it has earned it. Celia danced the second dance with her hand in Micah's and his hand at her waist, and the music was fast and then slow, and when it slowed, she was close enough to feel the warmth coming off him, and to notice that he smelled of wood smoke and cold air, and whatever soap Mrs. Farley provided, and she thought that she could stand here for a great deal longer than the dance lasted. After the second dance, he kept her hand for a moment and she let him, and across the room Agnes was talking to the doctor's wife with an expression of complete absorption that was entirely unconvincing. In January, Micah went to see a man named Wheeler about a piece of land. He told Celia about it on the Sunday walk, the river path, which was clear enough in winter if you stayed on the upper bank and did not mind the cold. Wheeler had 30 acres on the south side of town that he was looking to sell good land, he said, with water access and a small existing structure that was in need of work but was fundamentally sound, and he had been thinking about it since October and he had saved enough, with the freight wages, for the down payment. "You are thinking of putting down roots in Fort Collins," Celia said. She said it carefully, with the same caution she applied to all important things, testing the shape of it. "I am thinking," he said, "that Fort Collins has things worth putting down roots near." He said this simply and without overemphasis, which was how he said the most important things. "The freight work will not last forever. Patterson is talking about expanding his Cheyenne route, and I would be driving 6 months out of the year and not driving the other 6, and that is not steady enough for land payments. But I was thinking about the store. Thomas's store. Thomas and I have been talking," he said. "He wants to expand. He has been turning away wholesale orders because he does not have the warehouse space and the inventory. I know freight and supply routes well enough to run that end of the operation. He is looking for a partner who brings route knowledge and he would put in the capital." He glanced at her. "It makes practical sense." Celia looked at the river. She was thinking several things at once. She was thinking about what Agnes had said about Thomas wanting to expand. She was thinking about how naturally Micah fit into the texture of this place, the way he talked to people on the street, the way the other men at the freight office spoke about him, the way the Wheeler land was a sound investment even from a purely financial perspective. She was thinking about 30 acres on the south side of town with water access and a small existing structure. She was thinking about what she wanted. "Micah," she said, "yes, I want to see the land." He looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes. Then he said, "I was hoping you would say that." They went the following Tuesday, which pleased Celia on a purely sentimental level. The Wheeler land was everything he had described, rolling slightly at the south end where it met the base of the first hills, flat enough near the creek for building, with a stand of cottonwoods along the water that would be spectacular in spring. The existing structure was a cabin of sorts, 2 rooms, rough construction but solid logs, and a sound roof, the kind of place that could be made into something with work and intention. Celia stood at the edge of the creek on that cold January day and looked out at the land and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, felt it in her feet, actually. The particular settled recognition of a place where you could imagine being, not just passing through. "Well," Micah said. He was standing a few feet away, watching her the way he always watched her when she was thinking about something important, attentively but without pressure, giving her the space to arrive at whatever conclusion was hers to arrive at. She turned to look at him. The January light was pale and clear, and it fell on his face with a frankness that showed everything: the weathering and the character, the slight asymmetry of his nose where it had been broken once and not set properly, the gray-green eyes that were steady and warm and had never in her observation been anything other than honest. She had come from Dusthaven alone, saying her goodbyes to everything she knew, with $62 in a tin box and a mare named Tuesday and a map with small X's in brown ink, and she had not known what she was going toward. She had thought Fort Collins. She had thought Agnes's practical company. She had thought perhaps teaching. She had not thought this specific convergence of landscape and person and possibility, this feeling of ground that could hold the weight of something real. "It is beautiful land," she said. "It could be more than that," he said, quietly, carefully, with all of the meaning he was trying not to overpress contained in the way he held very still and let her answer in her own time. "I know," she said. "I know it could." She crossed the few feet of winter grass between them and she looked up at him and she said, "I am there now. Wherever you were telling me about, I am there." He exhaled. She watched something release in him, something he had been holding with great patience and discipline, and which, now that it released, left his face entirely open, the way a landscape opens after the pass. He kissed her in the pale January light beside Wheeler's Creek, gently at first and then with more intention, her cold face between his warm hands, and she kissed him back with everything she had been learning to trust, and the cottonwoods stood bare above them against a sky that was the pale blue of distances. And Tuesday, tied to a fence post 50 yards away, ignored the entire proceeding with magnificent indifference. Micah bought the Wheeler land. He and Thomas Aldrich came to terms on a partnership in the expanded dry goods and supply operation over a series of evening conversations at the table in Agnes and Thomas's dining room, with Celia keeping the account books and occasionally pointing out when one or the other of them had made an arithmetic error, which happened more than either man found entirely comfortable, but which they both accepted because she was simply always right. They were married in March, when the land was beginning its first tentative greening and the mountains to the west were still snow-capped, but the passes were opening, and the air had that particular quality of early spring in Colorado, raw and bright, and filled with a sense of things beginning. The wedding was small because that was what they both wanted. The minister from the church, Agnes and Thomas, Mrs. Farley, who had developed an opinion about Micah that was quite favorable, and expressed it by appearing uninvited in a very good dress, that suggested she had been expecting an invitation, which had simply been slow in arriving. Jim Patterson, who came because Thomas invited him and stayed because the food was good, and a few of the neighbors who had become Celia's neighbors over these months in Fort Collins. Celia wore her good dress, the one she had packed in the wagon with the thought that she might need it for something, which turned out to have been an accurate if not entirely prescient instinct, and she had put her hair up in a way that Agnes had helped with, and she stood beside Micah in the clear March light and made her promises in a voice that did not waver, because she meant every word. Micah's voice did not waver either. He held her hands and said the words, and looked at her with an expression that she would think about for the rest of her life, direct and full and so entirely certain that there was no performance in it at all, only the real thing. They moved into the cabin on the Wheeler land the following week, which was still rough around the edges but was theirs, which made the roughness entirely beside the point. Micah had spent the preceding 2 weeks making it livable new glass in the windows, the floor swept and relayed, the stove cleaned and tested, a shelf built along the kitchen wall that she had mentioned would be useful. She hung her mother's quilt on the bedroom wall where it caught the morning light and turned the room warm, and she put her father's Bible on the new shelf, and she stood in the middle of the 2 rooms and felt the thing she had been looking for in 160 acres of hard Kansas ground and had not found, a sense of having arrived somewhere that was hers and was right. Spring opened properly in April, and the cottonwoods came out along the creek in that vivid particular green that cottonwoods made, and the land greened around them, and the mountains lost their winter white slowly from the bottom up like a letter being read. Celia planted a kitchen garden at the east side of the cabin: beans, squash, a few rows of corn, herbs in small pots along the windowsill. And Micah fenced the south pasture for a second horse and began the conversation with a neighboring farmer about a small dairy cow, which was very practical, but which also meant that the cabin was beginning to accumulate the particular texture of a home that intends to be one for a long time. Tuesday had a pasture of her own and showed every sign of knowing it, moving through it with the dignity of a horse who had worked for her comfort and found it entirely appropriate. The freight partnership with Thomas Aldrich grew quickly through the spring and summer of 1875. Micah's knowledge of the Cheyenne and Denver supply routes, combined with Thomas's established store reputation, meant that they were able to bring in wholesale goods from suppliers who would not have dealt with the store before, and the Aldrich Carver Supply Co., as it was informally called, became within the year one of the better regarded operations between Denver and the Wyoming Territory. There was satisfaction in this, honest satisfaction, the kind that came from work done with capability and integrity, and Micah wore it with the quiet ease of a man who had been waiting a long time to feel it. Celia was teaching by then. It had come about in the way that things came about in a town like Fort Collins, naturally, through a convergence of need and availability and word of mouth. The schoolmaster had left in May of 1875, relocating to Denver for reasons that remained somewhat unclear, and the school board had needed a replacement before the fall term, and Dr. Hooper, who was on the board, had come into Thomas's store one afternoon in June and mentioned it to Thomas, who had mentioned it to Celia. And Celia had gone to see Dr. Hooper and the school board that same week with a composure that was entirely real, and said that she would like the position. She had taught at the Fort Collins School for the children of the settlement between 12 and 20 students depending on the season and whether the farming families needed their older children at home. And she was good at it in a way that surprised no one who had paid attention, which included Micah, Agnes, Thomas, and most of the children within the first month. She was firm and fair and interesting, which was a combination that produced a particular loyalty in students. She taught reading and arithmetic, some history, and she read aloud at the end of each day for the last half hour from whatever book she had, and the children stayed for the reading even when they could have left, which told her something important about what people needed and were willing to stay still for. She was also, by autumn of 1875, expecting a child. She told Micah on a September evening sitting on the cabin's front step with the mountains taking the last colors of sunset in their snow and the air just turning cool. And she said it simply and directly, which was her way, and watched his face. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned to her with an expression that was not the theatrical overflow she might have expected from someone else, but was, from him, entirely characteristic, a deep and complete warmth that his face barely contained, and that he expressed by taking both her hands in his and holding them for a long moment without speaking, as if the grip itself was the sentence. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling fine," she said. "Tired some mornings, but otherwise fine." "Good," he said. He looked at her hands in his, then at her face. "We are going to need more shelf space," she laughed, the real laugh, the surprised one. "That is what you have to say." "I am extremely happy," he said. "I also thought you would appreciate the practical implication." "I do," she said, laughing still. "I appreciate both." He pulled her into his side, and she leaned against him, and they sat on the step in the September evening. And the mountains held their colors a little longer than the rest of the sky. And Tuesday moved across the pasture with the sound of quiet hooves. And Celia thought that she had come a very long way from the woman who had packed her tin box and said her goodbyes to Dusthaven, and also that she had not traveled any distance at all from herself. She was more entirely herself here than she had been in years. Their son was born in April of 1876, in the cabin, with Agnes serving as midwife and the doctor present and Micah on the other side of the cabin door, because Agnes had opinions about what was appropriate, and those opinions were enforced. And Celia had never in her life done anything as difficult or as consuming or as absolute as that night. And when it was over, and Agnes put the baby in her arms, and the baby was red-faced and furious and completely perfect, she wept for the first time in a very long time, and did not try to stop herself. Micah came in and stood at the edge of the bed and looked at the two of them with an expression that was not describable in any terms she had in her possession, and she reached out her free hand, and he took it and held it and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. They named him James Robert Carver. James for Micah's Tennessee grandfather, who had apparently been a man of considerable personal integrity, and Robert after Celia's late husband, which was a decision she had arrived at quietly, and which Micah had received without comment, and with, she thought, a particular respect for her, for the fact that her history was hers to honor in the way she chose, and that honoring it did not diminish what was present and real. James Robert was a forthright and serious baby, who became a forthright and serious child with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's particular way of listening. He grew up on the 30 acres of Carver land with Tuesday's successor, a young gray gelding named Monday, because Celia had decided to commit to the pattern, and with the mountains visible from every window, and with two parents who talked to him with the same directness they gave each other, which meant he grew up knowing that words meant what they said, and said what they meant, which was a gift whose value he would not fully appreciate for many years. In 1878, Celia had a miscarriage in the early weeks, and this was its own particular grief, quiet and private, the grief of a possibility rather than a person, and Micah held her through it with a steadiness that did not try to minimize it or rush past it, only stayed. She healed from it in the way she healed from most things, by going back to what she knew was real. The school, the children in rows with their books and their arithmetic, Tuesday's long-established approval of her morning presence, Micah's hands, James Robert's serious gray-green gaze. In 1879, their daughter Eleanor came, a small, determined person from the first breath, who had Celia's dark hair and Micah's smile, and the absolute combined temperament of two people who had decided early that they were going to manage their lives rather than be managed by them. Eleanor Carver was, from the age of approximately 2, completely ungovernable in the most charming possible way, and her parents, who were fair and consistent in all other matters, were observed by Agnes to be entirely susceptible to her. Agnes said this with great satisfaction, because she was very fond of Eleanor and found the susceptibility entirely appropriate. By 1880, the Aldrich Carver Supply Company was the largest wholesale dry goods operation between Denver and Cheyenne, which was not a grand empire by any measure, but was a solid and respectable establishment that employed 6 people, and paid them properly, and operated on the principle that Micah had been trying to apply to everything since the lesson of Cole Edie and the ranch near Dodge City. That the only thing worth building was something you could be entirely honest about. Because dishonest things required maintenance that honest things did not. Thomas Aldrich had spoken to his lawyer about the partnership documents in a way that left nothing ambiguous, and Micah owned exactly his half in terms that no clever man with access to a sympathetic judge could reframe, which was the first time in 9 years that Micah Carver had been able to look at a piece of land or a piece of paper that said his name on it and not feel the shadow of Cole Edie somewhere behind it. He told Celia this one evening, and she heard the thing underneath it, the release of something long held, and said, "Good. You should have had that 9 years ago." And he said, "Yes, but then I would not have been on that road outside of Dusthaven." "Hector might not have gotten loose," she said. "Hector always got loose," he said. "He was a menace. 17 hands of pure, ill-timed initiative." Celia laughed, and he looked at her laughing, and they were sitting on the front step of the cabin again, a larger and more solid structure now, with a second room added and a proper porch that had been one of the first things Celia had requested, because she wanted somewhere to sit with the mountains in view that was not standing in the cold. And James Robert was inside doing his reading with the lamp on, and Alina was theoretically asleep, but almost certainly was not. And the night sky was extravagant in the way of Colorado night skies, too many stars to count, the mountains a dark and massive shape against the silver dark of the late summer horizon. Celia leaned against Micah's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the particular silence that was their version of contentment, not the absence of things to say but the fullness of having enough. "Do you ever think about Dusthaven?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "The cemetery, Robert's grave." She paused. "I ought to write to someone there and ask that the marker be maintained. I should have done that before I left." "We can go back someday," he said. "If you want to." "Maybe," she said. "I think I mostly want to go forward." She looked out at the mountains. "I came west because I did not know what was ahead. I just knew I needed to move. And now I know exactly what is ahead," she said, "and I would not go back and undo any of it." She turned to look at him in the dark. "Even the ditch." "Especially the ditch," he said. She kissed him then, simply and fully, on the front porch of the house they had built, and the night air was warm with late summer and the smell of the creek in the garden. And from inside the house James Robert called out something about whether he could have one more chapter, and Alina, who was definitely not asleep, called out that she wanted one too, and Micah pulled back and looked at Celia with that smile, that specific earned smile, and said, "Shall I?" "I will get Alina," Celia said. "You take James Robert." They went inside together, into the lamplight and the children's voices and the smell of the pinewood stove and the ordinary extraordinary life they had built in the country between the Kansas grass and the Colorado mountains. And the door closed behind them with the comfortable sound of a thing arriving exactly where it belongs. It had begun on a road outside of Dusthaven with a spooked horse and a wagon in a ditch, and a woman who had already said all of her goodbyes, sure that she was going forward into something unknown and alone. She had been right about the unknown and entirely wrong about the alone. Some beginnings arrived sideways, roan-colored and wild-eyed, stepping directly into your path before you had a chance to plan for them. And the only thing to do was hold your reins steady and see what came out of the brush. What came out in the end was this. A man who told you things plainly, 30 acres of Colorado ground with cottonwoods along the creek, a son with gray-green eyes, and a daughter who was ungovernable in the best possible way, Sunday suppers with family who knew you and loved you without requiring you to be other than you were, a school full of children who stayed for the reading at the end of the day, and mornings upon mornings upon mornings, with the mountains on the horizon doing what mountains did, standing enormous and permanent and old against the sky, reminding everything below them that endurance was not stubbornness, but simply the willingness to stay. Celia Baker had said her goodbyes, and then she had said every hello that mattered. The summer of 1882 brought a long stretch of clear weather that was good for the supply routes and good for the crops and good for people generally. The kind of summer that a hard country offers occasionally, as if in acknowledgement of what it costs to live there. James Robert was 6 and could read well enough to help Celia in the schoolroom on days when she needed an extra hand, which he performed with great seriousness and a slightly proprietary attitude toward the younger students that Celia gently and consistently redirected. Alina was 3 and had begun to speak in fully formed sentences that contained, already, a directness that made visitors blink and her parents deeply proud. Tuesday, old but comfortable, had her pasture and her hay and her long relationship with Celia, and she would live 3 more years still, dying on a warm October morning as peacefully as a horse could, and Celia would bury her at the edge of the south pasture and plant a cottonwood sapling over the spot. And years later, when the tree was large and old, it would be the first tree the children climbed, and the place where the family gathered on summer evenings. And there was something right about that. Something that spoke to the way things and people and places accumulated meaning in a life well lived, each thing becoming part of the structure of the next. Agnes and Thomas came for Sunday supper in late August of that summer, and they brought news that the town was proposing a new schoolhouse larger, with a proper floor and 2 rooms, and that Dr. Hooper had suggested Celia's name for the permanent appointment as head schoolmistress, which was a title that had not existed before and had been created essentially for her, which Celia understood and was moved by. She accepted. She ran the new school for 14 years, which covered not just the original students but their younger siblings, and eventually the children of those students. An entire generation of Fort Collins growing up through her classroom with the knowledge that words meant what they said, and that listening was as important as speaking, and that you stayed for the reading at the end because the reading was the point. Micah expanded the supply operation twice and sold his share back to Thomas in 1890 at a fair price that Thomas set because he was Thomas, and bought another 50 acres adjacent to the original Wheeler land because he wanted the water access, and because he had always intended to make something of the South End with its better soil. He planted it with a variety of crops and kept 4 horses by then and 2 dairy cows and a complicated relationship with a dozen chickens, and he built fences and mended fences and built again. And the work was the kind of work that accumulated satisfaction, the way some work did physically and visibly, day by day, piece by piece. He was 48 years old in 1892, and he looked like a man who had done what he intended with himself, which is a different kind of looking than simply looking well preserved. His gray-green eyes were the same, only steadier now than they had been on a road outside of Dusthaven in the October of 1874, and when he looked at Celia, they still had the quality she had first noticed and told herself not to notice, only more so now, more settled, more earned, more of what it had always been. James Robert Carver left for Denver at 18 to study law, because he had inherited his mother's precision with language and his father's conviction that the law ought to mean what it said, and that there were men who needed to ensure it did. He wrote letters home that were very long and extremely careful, which were read at the supper table and discussed with the seriousness they deserved, and he came home at Christmas and in summers, and each time he came home, he was more fully himself, which was all Celia and Micah had ever wanted for him. Alina Carver at 12 was already the most remarkable student Celia had taught, which posed an interesting problem of professional impartiality that Celia resolved by applying exactly the same standards to Alina that she applied to everyone else, which Alina appreciated because she wanted to be challenged and not coddled, which was entirely characteristic. At 16 she had decided she would be a doctor, which in 1895 in Colorado was not the simple plan it might have been in a different time or place. But Alina was the child of two people who had made plans in difficult territory before, and she had their stubbornness and their patience, which were both necessary. Micah and Celia were on their porch on an October evening in 1896, 22 years after a roan horse had stepped in front of a wagon on a road outside of Dusthaven, and the mountains were doing what they always did in October, wearing their first new snow on the upper elevations, reflecting the last light in colors that never repeated, standing enormous and old and patient against the enormous old patient sky. James Robert had a law practice in Denver now, and had married a woman named Clara in the spring, a practical and warm-hearted woman from a ranching family. And the letter last month had said that Clara was expecting their first child in the winter, which meant that by December Micah and Celia would be grandparents, which was a fact they had been absorbing from different angles since the letter arrived. Alina was in her second year of studies at a medical college in St. Louis, writing letters that were full of the particular intensity of a person doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing, every sentence forward-leaning. Celia leaned against Micah's side the way she had learned to lean against something completely dependable, without any of the tentativeness of the early years, without the calculation of a woman who has not yet decided whether a thing will hold. She leaned the way you lean against a mountain, not because you cannot stand without it, but because it is there and it is solid, and after 22 years the warmth of it is as familiar as your own skin. James Robert will be a good father, Micah said. He will, Celia agreed. He has had practice being serious about things. He got that from you. He got it from both of us, she said. You are the most serious person I have ever known about the things that matter. I am extremely light-hearted, Micah said, which was so far from how anyone had ever described Micah Carver that Celia turned to look at him. He was smiling, the smile, the real one. You are impossible, she said. You have mentioned that, he said, over the years. She settled back against his side. The stars were coming out over the mountains. The cottonwoods along the creek were fully bare now, their arms lifted against the sky in that winter configuration, and the air smelled of cold and pine and the good dry smell of the October land. Micah, she said, yes, I want you to know something. All right. She was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, she had stopped hesitating about important things some years back, had decided that hesitation was a form of protecting yourself from your own life, which was not a protection worth having. She was quiet because she was finding the right words, which was what she always did, because words meant what they said. I have been happy, she said, here, with you. I want you to know that I have been genuinely, specifically, deeply happy. He was quiet for a moment. She felt him breathe. So have I, he said, more than I believed I would be when I believed such things were possible. He paused. You are the reason the land is worth having. She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, just for a moment, and he held her the way he always held her, steady, complete, as if holding her was something he had been made for and was glad of it. The night came on fully, and the mountains darkened to silhouettes, and the stars were extravagant in the way of October Colorado skies, and the cabin behind them held everything they had built, the books, the quilts, the 2 rooms and the porch and the wide view, and the life that had accumulated in this place the way lives did when they were fully and honestly lived. Celia Baker had driven out of Dusthaven on an October morning with $62 and a mare named Tuesday and a map with small X's in brown ink, and she had said her goodbyes, every one of them, and she had pointed herself west without knowing what she was going toward, only that she needed to go. And a horse had stepped in front of her wagon, and the rest was everything.